There were more than 30 skirmishes and raids in Vermont during the American Revolution, but only one major battle. Historians have argued whether the Battle of Hubbardton was an insignificant encounter or whether it saved the Northern American Army to fight again at Saratoga. What is certain is that over the course of 90 minutes, on a Vermont hillside, Seth Warner's American force proved themselves the equals of the shock troops of the British Army and stopped the British pursuit in its tracks. In the spring of 1777, General John Burgoyne planned to lead his British army south on Lake Champlain, capture Ticonderoga, and then advance to Albany and link up with other British forces moving north from New York City. This would cut off New England from the rest of the United States and would be a major stepping stone toward British victory in the conflict. Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence were the most formidable fortifications on the continent. The natural strength of the cliffs and marshes were improved with entrenchments, redoubts, batteries, blockhouses, and 2 stockaded forts. The one weakness was the small size of the army manning the fortifications. The invading British army outnumbered the 4,000 American troops under General Arthur Sinclair by more than 2 to 1. General Burgoyne landed his Hessian forces on the Vermont shore. They moved to invest Mount Independence. The British forces were landed on the New York shore and engaged in skirmishes with elements of Colonel Seth Warner's regiment in the woods beyond Fort Ticonderoga. Warner's men fell back to the main American line, and the British occupied some of the outer posts. Burgoyne had planned to lay siege to Ticonderoga, but the British discovered that nearby Mount Defiance was undefended and hauled artillery to the summit. The position completely dominated Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. When General Sinclair realized what was happening, he called a council of war. The British would soon dominate the southern approaches, and the Hessians would cut off supply from the east. In a matter of days, starvation would force the American army to surrender. Sinclair and his senior officers decided to evacuate the fortifications that night under cover of darkness. The top of Mount Independence lit up as one American officer set his hut on fire, and several deserters went over to the British lines. Burgoyne realized what was happening, and at the first light of dawn, elated British troops entered the empty works. What they had viewed as the largest obstacle on the route to Albany had been taken in only a few days, with very little loss. With the fort captured, General Burgoyne sent most of his advanced corps under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, marching after the retreating enemy. The American soldiers were dumbfounded when the orders came to pull out. Many had spent over a year turning Ticonderoga into the premier defensive position on the continent, and thought there was no better place to face their enemies. As they began a long and grueling march away from Mount Independence, morale plummeted. The day was hot, and the retreat dragged on, mile after weary mile. Ebenezer Fletcher was a 16-year-old fifer in the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment. The enemy pursued us so closely as to fire on our rear. A large body of the enemy followed us all day, but kept so far behind as not to be wholly discovered. Having just recovered from the measles, and not being able to march with the main body, I fell in the rear. The British suffered during the march as well.
We continued the pursuit the whole day without any sort of provisions, excepting one cow we happened to kill in the woods, which, without bread, was next to nothing among so many.
Brigadier General Fraser learned from some captured stragglers that the American rear guard was made up of about 450 of the best men in General Sinclair's army, under the command of Colonel Francis. Fraser sent a message to Burgoyne asking for the rest of his advanced corps to be sent along, but Burgoyne instead sent the Hessian Advanced Corps, under Lieutenant General Friedrich Riedesel, who outranked Fraser. Riedesel caught up with the pursuing British troops late in the afternoon.
I felt much hurt to be embarrassed with a senior officer, and not to order the remainder of my corps to join me. Burgoyne is a sensible, gallant man, but there are persons secretly jealous of all my poor endeavors to forward the public service. Riedesel told me his troops could not move further that night. I said with his permission I would proceed on the road towards Hubbardton, about 3 miles, or until I found a good post and water for my men. I told Riedesel I had discretionary powers to attack the enemy wherever I could come up with them, and that I determined to do it. It was agreed that at 3 o'clock the next morning, both corps should start together and continue the march to Skenesborough. In case General Fraser found the enemy too strong for him, he was to wait for me and thus offer a united front to the enemy.
As darkness fell on July 6th, General Riedesel's 1,100 Hessians bivouacked for the night at a place called Lacey's Camp. 3 miles beyond, General Fraser made camp with his 850 men. Fraser had with him a battalion of 10 light infantry companies under the command of 25-year-old Major Alexander Lindsay, Lord Balcarres, and a battalion of 10 grenadier companies under 31-year-old Major John Ackland, a member of Parliament who strongly opposed the American cause. Fraser also had 2 companies of his own old command, the 24th Regiment of Foot, under Major Robert Grant, accompanied by a party of native and loyalist scouts. Only a couple of miles beyond Fraser's camp was the tail end of the American army. The command of Colonel Ebenezer Francis was comprised of his own 11th Massachusetts, reinforced by picked companies from several other regiments. After marching 25 miles, they stopped for the night near the Selleck cabin at Hubbardton, Vermont. They were joined there by the 2nd New Hampshire under Colonel Nathan Hale, and by Colonel Seth Warner's Extra Continental Regiment from Vermont. During the retreat from Canada in 1776, Seth Warner had repeatedly held back the British long enough to take off the sick and wounded, and had become adept at rearguard operations. As the most senior officer on the scene, Warner commanded the whole force, about 950 fighting men. The rest of Sinclair's army was already several miles to the south. Warner, Francis, and Hale held a council of war in the Selleck cabin to determine their dispositions and plans for the following morning. Warner's main force encamped atop a steep hill by the Castletown Road. Some 300 stragglers, too sick or lame to keep up with the main army, staggered along at the rear of the column. They crossed a stream called Sucker Brook and could go no further. They camped in the bottomlands by the brook, under Colonel Hale's charge, covered by a few companies of New Hampshire and Massachusetts men positioned along the stream. Sentries were posted farther up the road to give advanced warning should the British approach. Warner sent a scouting force north following reports of a Loyalist raiding party. They were due to return at 7 a.m. the next morning. As soon as they arrived, the rear guard would resume the march south, bringing off the stragglers with them. Fraser and Riedesel's columns arose at 3 o'clock on the morning of July 7th and continued their pursuit. About 5 o'clock, the leading elements of Fraser's troops reached Sergeant's Hill, overlooking Sucker Brook, and were fired upon by a couple of sentries. Fraser brought his men to a halt. He sent his scouts out to reconnoiter the area for the presence of enemy troops, and sent word back to General Riedesel. The scouts returned an hour later to report that there were far more than the expected 450 Americans posted just ahead at Hubbardton. They were just waking up and clearly preparing to march. The 2 companies of the 24th Foot were at the head of the column. General Fraser and Major Grant met to determine whether to attack now or to wait for Riedesel and risk letting the Americans get away unscathed.
After marching 4 miles, I met Captain McKay, who had been sent by Fraser to inform me that he was on his march and would wait for me at Hubbardton. Surmising at once what the halt signified, I hastened on as quickly as possible with my advance guard to overtake Fraser. After marching a quarter of an hour, I heard a brisk firing of musketry.
The morning after our retreat, orders came very early for the troops to refresh and be ready for marching. Some were eating, some were cooking, and all in a very unfit posture for battle. Just as the sun rose, there was a cry, "The enemy are upon us!" Looking around, I saw the enemy in line of battle. Orders came to lay down our packs and be ready for action. The firing instantly began. While most of the stragglers rushed to get away, the 24th Foot came under fire from the companies posted by Sucker Brook. One of the first to be killed was Major Grant.
Upon his coming up with the enemy, he got upon the stump of a tree to reconnoiter, and had hardly given the men orders to fire when he was struck by a ball, fell off the tree, and never uttered another syllable.
The British lead elements rapidly formed and pressed the attack. At the commencement of the battle, many of our party retreated back into the woods. Captain Carr came up and says, "My lads, advance! We shall beat them yet." A few of us followed him in view of the enemy. Every man was trying to secure himself behind girdled trees. I made shelter for myself and discharged my piece. Having loaded again and taken aim, my piece missed fire. I brought the same a second time to my face, but before I had time to discharge it, I received a musket ball in the small of my back and fell with my gun cocked. My uncle was standing but little distance from me. He and another man lifted me and carried me back some distance and laid me down behind a large tree, where was another man, crying out most bitterly with a grievous wound. By this time I had bled so freely I was very weak and faint. Our men began to retreat, and the enemy to advance. To remain where I was and fall into the hands of the enemy, expecting to receive no mercy, it came into my mind to conceal myself from them if possible. I made use of my hands and knees as well as I could and crawled about 2 rods behind some small brush and got under a log. The enemy pursued our men in great haste. Some of them came over the log where I lay. Some came so near I could almost touch them. Colonel Hale led a large number of the stragglers into the woods, and the Sucker Brook line melted away. But the British had sustained 21 casualties during the short fight, including Major Grant. As the British troops chased the Americans toward the Castletown Road intersection, the main camp of the rear guard was abuzz with activity. The men were preparing to march south and make their escape. At 7 o'clock, Colonel Francis came to me and desired me to parade the regiment, which I did. At 7:15, he came in haste and told me an express had arrived from General Sinclair, informing that we must march with the greatest expedition or the enemy would be upon us. Also that they had taken Skenesborough with all our baggage. He ordered me to march the regiment immediately. I marched a part of the regiment at 20 minutes past 7. But the British pursuit was rapid, and as the American rear guard began to move, British troops emerged into the clearing at the base of the hill. Seeing instantly that it was too late to get away, Warner ordered his men to face to the right and attack.
I was at the head of the light infantry battalion, and it had a pretty steep hill on the left flank. I halted the light infantry, faced them to the left, and with the whole in front, I ran up the hill with them, and we met the rebels endeavoring to get possession of it.
Fraser's light infantry met Francis's reinforced 11th Massachusetts near the crest of the hill. A vicious fight ensued at very close range. Our men fired briskly, ascended the hill within 30 yards of the rebels, and immediately began a brisk fire.
The light infantry then formed, as well as the 24th Regiment, the former of which suffered very much from the enemy's fire, particularly the companies of the 29th and 34th Regiments. Upon the very first attack of the light infantry, Lieutenant Haggett received a ball in each of his eyes.
While the fight for the hill raged, Warner's regiment confronted the 2 companies of the 24th Foot in the hollow south of the hill. The 24th Foot was heavily outnumbered, and Warner's men began to turn their right flank.
I ordered the Grenadiers to support the right, with directions to prevent, if possible, the enemies gaining the road which leads to Castletown and Skenesborough.
The Grenadiers formed in the woods to the right of the 24th Foot.
This being the first serious engagement I had ever been in, I must own, when we received orders to prime and load, which we had barely time to do before we received a heavy fire, the idea of perhaps a few moments conveying me before the presence of my Creator had its force. The woods were so thick that little or no order could be observed in advancing upon the enemy, it being totally impossible to form a regular line. Personal courage and intrepidity was therefore to supply the place of military skill and discipline.
Now it was Warner's regiment that was heavily outnumbered, and as the Grenadiers attacked, the Vermonters slowly gave ground.
Captain Harris was wounded. I could not pass by him as he lay under a tree where he had scrambled on hands and knees to protect him from the scattering shot without going up to see what assistance could be afforded him and learn if he was severely wounded. The ball had entered at his hip and passed through a certain part adjoining.
British sources describe the light infantry taking the hill, but more likely Colonel Francis fell back under orders.
The light infantry beat the enemy from the first hill and drove them to the hill of less eminence, which was their original post.
The fight on the second, smaller height was short. Colonel Warner continued to withdraw his 3 regiments to the cover of a high log fence along the Castletown road. Fraser's light infantry pressed the attack closely.
Captain Enos Stone went forward, and from the rail fence east of the garden next to the Selleck house removed the 3 top rails for 7 or 8 lengths so that we could have a better chance at them. We drove them back by cutting them down so fast.
As the casualties mounted among the light infantry in front of the fence, Fraser realized he faced an enemy force that he might not be able to defeat. He sent a message to Riedesel to come quickly.
An officer arrived from Fraser and reported that the former had met the enemy in such force that he would not be able to withstand him unless speedily reinforced. I accordingly sent word to Fraser that I would soon be with him.
The light infantry regrouped and attacked the fence a second time, and were once again forced back under heavy fire. On their right, Warner's regiment's accurate musketry held off the grenadiers and struck down 8 of their officers, including Major Ackland, who received a musket ball in the thigh.
In this action, I found all manual of exercise is but an ornament, and the only object of importance it can boast of was that of loading, firing, and charging with bayonets. The confusion of a man's ideas during the time of action is great. Several of the men, upon examining their muskets, found 5 or 6 cartridges which they were positive of having discharged.
The grenadiers continually pushed Warner's left, which bent back, but held.
They continued retreating from one post to another, the country affording them many.
Warner now realized that the British in his front were all the force at hand, and that he could defeat them.
The enemy observed the weakness of my left, where I was in person, and made some demonstrations to renew the attack. They began pretty briskly.
The 2nd New Hampshire crossed the log fence and raked the light infantry with flanking fire. Some of Colonel Francis's men joined in the attack, and the light infantry's left bent back on itself and began to collapse. The companies struck by this assault were shot to pieces. The light company of the 34th Regiment sustained casualties approaching 70%.
Lord Balcarres, who commands the light infantry, had near 30 balls shot through his jacket and trousers, and yet only received a small graze on the hip. Lieutenant Douglas of the 29th Regiment, as he was carried off the field wounded, received a ball directly through his heart.
Just as the American assault was about to sweep the field, Riedesel arrived on the scene with an advance force of 180 men.
At last we arrived upon an eminence from which we could see the contending forces. I saw at a glance that the Americans were moving more and more towards their right, with the evident intention of surrounding Fraser's left wing. I therefore resolved to outmaneuver them and get into the enemy's rear. At this moment an aide arrived with a message from Fraser to the effect that he feared his left wing would be surrounded. I sent word back to him that I was at that very instant about to attack the enemy's right wing.
After 90 minutes of battle, both the British and the Americans were tired and running low on ammunition. The arrival of fresh Hessian troops with full cartridge boxes completely tipped the scale.
The company of Jaegers advanced courageously upon the enemy and were met by a brisk fire. The Brunswickers did not flinch, but paid them back with interest. They advanced upon the enemy with fixed bayonets and to the sound of music. In 12 minutes they had beaten them completely. When seeing that they were partly surrounded, the Americans stopped fighting and retreated. The American Francis fell, pierced by a German bullet, while leading the attack on the left wing. A Major Bernard with some of the German light troops came up. They entered into the action in the handsomest manner possible. The firing slackened immediately.
With Hessians turning the American right, British grenadiers working their way around the left, and Colonel Francis killed, Warner saw that it was time to disengage. The American forces left the log fence, crossed the open ground sloping toward the base of Pittsford Ridge, and retreated into the woods.
Riedesel then came to the rear of the place where I stationed myself. A few scattering shots were still flying from the enemy. I stepped to the general, and the rebels disappearing, there was no more firing to be heard anywhere.
General Fraser acknowledged that he would have been in great danger had it not been for my timely aid, for if reinforcements had not arrived just when they did, the whole corps would have been surrounded and cut off. As the Americans fell back through the woods, some portion of the British troops pursued them. There was a running fight on Pittsford Ridge, and the British took a number of prisoners, but most of the Americans escaped. Warner left behind a screening force to watch and harass the British and Hessian forces.
Even after the action was over, there were lurking parties hovering about in the woods. A number of officers were collected to read the papers taken out of the pocketbook of Colonel Francis, when Captain Shrimpton of the 62nd Regiment, who had the papers in his hand, jumped up and fell, exclaiming he was severely wounded. We all heard the ball whiz by us, and turning to the place from whence the report came, saw the smoke, but could find no person.
As the British secured the area, they stumbled upon Colonel Hale, with 70 of the stragglers hiding in the woods. They surrendered without a fight, and were brought up the hill where the dead and wounded of both sides littered the ground.
The conflict once over, the mind returns to its proper sense of feeling, and deeply must its sensibility be wounded when the eye glances over the field of slaughter, where so many brave fellows, who a few hours before were high in spirits and full of the vigor of life, are laid low in the dust, and the ear continually pierced with the deep sighs and groans of the wounded and dying. I saw Colonel Francis after he fell, and his appearance caused me to remark on his figure, which was fine and even at that time made me regard him with attention. Our men got more plunder than they could carry, and great quantities of paper money, which was not in the least regarded. I made prize of a pretty good mare.
24 Hessians were killed or wounded during their brief but decisive involvement in the Battle of Hubbardton. 50 British soldiers were killed, another 134 wounded. Warner's rear guard had inflicted over 20% casualties on the shock troops of Burgoyne's army. One of those wounded was Captain James Craig of the 47th Regiment's Light Infantry Company. He'd been severely wounded at Bunker Hill 2 years earlier, and would be wounded again at Saratoga in September. In 1807, he became the Governor-General of Canada. The American forces had 41 killed, 96 wounded, and 234 taken prisoner, but many of those were among the stragglers taken early in the fighting at Sucker Brook, or among Hale's contingent, who surrendered just after the battle ended. I was not discovered by the enemy till the battle was over. They were picking up the dead and wounded among the brush and logs. I heard them coming toward me, and began to be much terrified lest I should be found. 2 of the enemy came so nigh, I heard one of them say, "Here is one of the rebels." They soon came to me, and pulled off my shoes, supposing me to be dead. I looked up and spoke, telling them I was their prisoner, and begged to be used well. "Damn you," says one, "you deserve to be used well, don't you? What's such a young rebel as you fighting for?" One of these men was an officer who appeared to be a pretty sort of man. He spoke to the soldier, who had taken my shoes, and said, "Give back the shoes and help the man into camp." The soldier then raised me upon my feet, and conducted me to the British camp. Here I found a number of my brother soldiers in the same situation as myself. I was laid on the ground and remained till the afternoon before my wound was dressed. 2 doctors came to my assistance and examined my back. One of them said, "My lad, you stood a narrow chance. Had the ball gone in or out half its bigness, you must have been killed instantly." The doctors appeared to be very kind and faithful. They pulled several pieces of my clothes from my wound. Some of the enemy were very kind, while others were very spiteful and malicious. One of them came and took my silver shoe buckles and left me an old pair of brass ones. Another came and took my neck handkerchief. I was stripped of everything valuable about me.
After the engagement, we made sort of huts covered with the bark of trees for our wounded, who were in a very bad situation, as we had nothing to assist them till the return of an express which was sent to Ticonderoga for surgeons. We were very badly off for provisions, and nothing but water to drink, and though it rained very hard after the engagement, we had no covering to shelter us, our poor huts being a wretched security against the heavy rain.
The battle increased tension between the invading British and Hessian forces. We rescued the idiotic Englishman Fraser and his people. From my group, Hans Mock from Angersbach and Karl Kimpel from Steinhausen were killed. General Riedesel rages with anger because the Englishman had gotten himself into trouble completely needlessly, which we had to pay for with much blood. General Riedesel mentioned that only his oath to the king and that his wife Charlotte had followed him here still kept him in Canada. The day after the battle, the Hessians marched off toward Burgoyne's main army at Skenesborough. With their departure, the American scouting parties withdrew to report that the British pursuit had ended. The American prisoners were sent to Ticonderoga. Some of the wounded went with them, but those too badly wounded to be moved remained at Hubbardton for weeks after the fighting. July 13th, 1777. Here I remain with the wounded to give them every assistance in my power, which you must allow cannot be great, without a nous or any other necessary on the face of the earth. Were it not for the defeat of the rebels and the rout they were put to, which obliged them to leave their blankets, knapsacks, and a few camp kettles, I know not what would become of the wounded. Most of them are in sheds made of boughs, which are no defense from rain, which unfortunately set in these 3 or 4 days past almost constantly. I have not a pleasing prospect of their recovery, and as opportunity and their situation admits, I send them to Mount Independence. I never experienced more uneasiness at seeing the wounded suffer, nor do I wish to ever be in so disagreeable a situation again, my hands imbued in blood, my face as dirty. The British buried their dead on the field, but left many of the American corpses to rot where they lay. After the war, locals gathered them up and buried them. Warner's regiment made their headquarters in Manchester and skirmished with Loyalists and Hessians in the area. They arrived in Bennington just in time to save the victorious militia from a strong Hessian relief column, and then participated in the raids on Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence in September, freeing many of the prisoners taken at Hubbardton. They would continue to hold the northern frontier until the regiment was destroyed at the Battle of Fort George in 1780. Colonel Seth Warner suffered diminishing health and died penniless in 1784 at the age of 41. The 11th Massachusetts served at Saratoga and Monmouth and was disbanded in 1781. The 2nd New Hampshire was heavily engaged in both battles at Saratoga and was at Monmouth and Yorktown. Colonel Nathan Hale was never exchanged following his capture at Hubbardton and died a British prisoner in 1780. All of the British and Hessian forces engaged at Hubbardton were lost or surrendered in the following months at Bennington and Saratoga. General Simon Fraser was severely wounded at the Second Battle of Saratoga. General Riedesel's wife was in charge of his care, but his wound proved mortal. Riedesel himself returned to Braunschweig after the war and died in 1800. Alexander Lindsay, who commanded the light infantry at Hubbardton, was surrendered at Saratoga. He was released in 1779 and went on to become a major general in the British Army and governor of Jamaica. John Ackland of the Grenadiers was severely wounded at the Second Battle of Saratoga and taken prisoner by the Americans, who allowed his wife safe passage through the lines to nurse him back to health. Ackland was so impressed by his good treatment that when a man disparaged the Americans at a dinner party in England in 1778, Ackland corrected him so sharply that a duel ensued. Neither party was injured in the duel, but Ackland fell ill from the exposure and died soon after. The Battle of Hubbardton was the 16th bloodiest battle of the American Revolution. There were more casualties at Hubbardton than at Lexington and Concord, Princeton, or White Plains. More men were killed and wounded than at the battles of Bennington or Trenton. For its size, Hubbardton was extremely costly by Revolutionary War standards. Some historians have called Hubbardton an insignificant rearguard action. Others have claimed that it saved Sinclair's army to fight another day at Saratoga. In retrospect, the battle was an early indication that Burgoyne's campaign would not unfold as he had anticipated. What is certain is that at Hubbardton, Warner's men showed that Continental soldiers could go toe-to-toe with the best of the British Army and prove themselves every bit their equal. The Hubbardton battlefield is now a Vermont State Historic Site and one of the most beautiful and unspoiled battlefields in North America. The Visitor Center contains maps, visual aids, and artifacts from the battle itself. Trails and interpretive signs guide visitors through some of the key locations. Each year, visitors watch reenactors recreate portions of the battle on the actual ground where the events occurred. But most of the time, it is a quiet place of incredible natural beauty and solitude, where those killed during one morning in 1777 still rest in unmarked graves.